Hello, and welcome to the final David Bradford seminar of the spring 2021 semester. My name is Keely Swan, and I'm the Assistant Director of CPRE, the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, which organizes the seminar series. I'd also like to thank the many other campus organizers who have been co-sponsoring today's talk, including the High Meadows Environmental Institute, the Office of Sustainability, Canadian Studies, Indigenous Studies, and the student organization Natives at Princeton. It's my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Deborah McGregor, an associate professor in York University's Osgoode Hall Law Faculty. She's cross-appointed with the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change and serves as the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. Professor McGregor's research is focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, and sustainable development. Dr. McGregor is Anishinabe from Whitefish River First Nation, Birch Island, Ontario. As we honor the perspective that she's sharing with us today, we would also like to acknowledge that the land on which Princeton University stands is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to Lenape peoples past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. Since this is a virtual event, with a number of people joining us from various locations, we'll also be sharing a resource in the chat that allows you to look up what native lands you might currently be on yourself. For those of you who have been following our seminar series this year, you may have noticed that environmental justice has been a theme of many of our talks, and our center is looking forward to expanding our research in this area to think about the importance of equity and the involvement of all people in developing sound environmental policies. We're thrilled to learn from Dr. McGregor today on the topic of Indigenous environmental justice, knowledge, and law. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic on to her for her presentation, and we'll have time at the end for discussion and more questions. Welcome, Dr. McGregor.
Thank you, Chmiigwech. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, I guess, on the planet and where you're tuning in from. So first of all, I want to thank you for having me and having me talk about a topic I really like to talk about and spend a lot of time thinking about and engaging in research in many different ways. As I was thinking about this talk and realizing I was going to be in a policy context, a lot of my more recent work is thinking of how to include Indigenous knowledge systems, legal systems in broader sort of environmental and climate change policy contexts. So what I wanted to do first is just talk a little bit about the perspective that I bring to the topic. And it was something I had to think a great deal about because prior to joining York University, I was at the University of Toronto in the Department of Geography and the Indigenous Studies program. So a lot of my work was around always dealing with environmental governance, resource management. And then when I decided to apply for a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice, I thought, well, I think what I do, but I'm not 100% sure what this thing is, because at the time there really wasn't anything. You couldn't Google Indigenous Environmental Justice, and the whole theory, methods, and conceptual frameworks would come up. It had to be developed. So it was a bit of a daunting task, but I think I've managed to wrap my head around the whole idea and try to frame it and center it from an Indigenous worldview and ontological perspective, which is what I'll talk about today. What makes it distinct? How is it distinct from, let's say, if the field of environmental justice or environmental racism? People frame this a little bit differently, and how does it become distinctly Indigenous? And recognize the diversity of Indigenous peoples around the world and in North America or Turtle Island, probably primarily the folks that I'll be speaking to today. So this is informed by who I am as an Anishinaabe person, and I'll talk a little bit about that, how I ground, how I think, how I approach my work, how my accountability to some extent, academic work that I had done previously and how it fed into how I was conceptualizing Indigenous environmental justice and injustice, probably more injustice and then justice, trying to figure out what does that look like? Like, what is it that we're striving for? What's our vision for this? And also informed by working with First Nations continually throughout my academic career. I continue to still work with Indigenous nations directly in their research and their policy work, which is why policy is still foremost in terms of how I think about these questions and how can you have an impact. So the work I do isn't just like theory, it's like what kind of impact can it have in the real world. So how I've approached this is, I also worked for Environment Canada, now called Environment Canada and Climate Change, for a decade. And my job there as a senior policy advisor in Indigenous policy and Indigenous affairs, I guess the best way to sum it up when I try to explain it is my job was to try to work with my colleagues in a way where they could be respectful of Indigenous people, Indigenous rights, Indigenous knowledge in the work that they were doing, because clearly what they're doing is going to be impacting the lives and lands and future of Indigenous peoples. And there I worked on traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, self-government file, and duty to consult and accommodate, and trying to build capacity in Indigenous communities to be able to engage in their own governance and also to engage with others' perspectives in terms of what humanity's relationship should look like to the natural world, I guess, is basically how I think about environmental governance. So all of these experiences all influenced how I started to try to work on what do we mean when we say Indigenous environmental justice. So I have prepared I'm hoping a brief PowerPoint. It just sort of keeps me on track. I have a lot more in my own notes, but we'll see how much I'm able to cover. And I really do look forward to the discussion as part of the seminar and then with students afterwards. So hopefully you'll enjoy this as much as I enjoy talking about it. So now I will share screen, just so you're aware, because I may spaz out, but hopefully not. Oops, where is the share screen? And I did manage to spaz out. There we go. And you'll have to try to keep me on track, because once I do share screen, I no longer see the time. So, so please feel free to say you have 5 minutes when I have 5 minutes. So the overview of what I wanted to talk about, people, place, and relationships, I talked a little bit about that. How is all of this work that I've done, including who I am as an Anishinaabe person and my responsibilities and accountability, where I've worked, people I continue to work for, influenced how I think about this topic. The role of colonialism in all of this. And I realized I was in speaking to a center that looks at policy, and again I'm engaged in some of this work, particularly climate policy, as part of the Assembly of First Nations. I'm on the Environment and Climate Change Committee that advises the Assembly of First Nations, which represents the over 600 First Nations in Canada, and does a lot of their advocacy to the federal government in terms of policy or legislation or different initiatives, program initiatives. And the role of colonialism in thinking through what's going to be appropriate policy, how do you take this into account so that you don't continue to colonize or impact Indigenous peoples in a negative way in policy development. So doing this in a number of fronts, including working on, at the moment, an Indigenous resilience report with a distinct perspective in terms of a national assessment on climate change. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think it's relevant, and I don't see it accounted for in a lot of public policy. I wanted to talk a bit about Indigenous knowledge systems, why they're relevant, how to think about them in these contexts. Indigenous legal traditions, which is an emerging field in Canada anyway, and I'm in my knowledge of what I'm reading in the United States context, certainly emerging there, how it's relevant in these conversations as well. And then how this all leads to understanding what Indigenous environmental justice is and how I'm conceptualizing it, and then looking at water justice as sort of a case study of how one applies that worldview and ontology and thinking about justice in a water justice context. So hopefully I'll be able to do this all within the next half hour. So there is a method to my madness in terms of what I'm hoping to share with you today. So the first thing I always say is anything that I'm talking about was already known here in Turtle Island or wherever Indigenous peoples are. People were there for thousands of years. People had developed, were complete societies. People had their own knowledge systems, legal systems, governance systems, interacted with each other as nations. So for example, where I am in the Great Lakes, I'm literally actually in my First Nation. I work in Toronto, but the nature of my research required me to be here for a period of time. So in the Great Lakes. So people were here for thousands of years. So we also interacted with each other as nations in knowledge sharing frameworks, different legal traditions coming into contact with one another. For example, I'm in Anishinabe and we have a treaty with the Haudenosaunee people. I guess people might know them as Iroquois. The Six Nations, because we didn't always get along, and we have a treaty with each other. It doesn't have anything to do with the crown, doesn't have anything to do with the government. It has to do with a treaty that we have. So we also engaged in treaties with each other. So that's important when thinking about legal systems, governance systems, and knowledge systems, that we were complete societies and continue to be so, however severely impacted by colonization and other processes. So to me, it's always important to recognize that, because some of these topics, particularly in the way that I talk about them and other scholars or practitioners or people in the community, it may be the first time many hear about it, but it's actually been around for a really long time. What's different is the interest in it, particularly in terms of looking at solutions to a lot of the crises that we're facing in the world, climate crisis, species disappearing, water crisis. So we're dealing with all these multiple ecological crises and looking to other knowledge systems, legal systems that might help address some of these challenges that we're all facing. So to me, it's always important to acknowledge that none of this is new from an Indigenous perspective. So this is just my family. So a big part of how I approach my scholarship is my obligations to my own family and community as an Anishinaabe person. The way that we think about knowledge is a verb, not a commodity or produced as a commodity. And so what's supposed to happen with knowledge once we've gained it, and I do this with my class when I'm teaching, is once you know something, you're expected to act on it. You're expected to be responsible for that knowledge. So a big part of what I've learned is when I've engaged in research or in some of the work I do directly with elders and traditional knowledge holders in communities, and they've conveyed knowledge to me, it's expected that I would act on that. And a lot of it has to do with my obligations, roles of responsibility to my family and to my communities. So making sure that what I'm doing is going to impact in a beneficial and positive and constructive way back to communities. So this is my family. I'm in Anishinaabe. The Thunderbird is our main symbol, and what you see, the animals there are the different clans. And I am a Makwa clan, which is bear. Again, we live in an area where we get seasons, although it's been very strange recently. And also, we're also fortunate that one of our most sacred areas, which is called Dreamers Rock, where people would go vision and fast, is still in our communities, and we caretake it. And that's the image. That's the logo of the First Nation, of the sun and the rock. So I have these obligations to place. Not only do I have obligations to place, I'm also informed by it in very real ways in terms of knowledge sharing that I'll talk about in terms of Indigenous ontology around this. So we think about the land and the world around us and the environment as also being our teachers and relatives. This is a different way of thinking about the world around us, as beyond the water would be a resource, commodity, property, or the land or forests and everything else. You can go to any website. I work in the Canadian context. I could go to Natural Resources Canada's website, and you'll see they'll talk about waters and forests and lands as being resources. That's not how Indigenous peoples traditionally thought about the lands and waters. They were thought about as being teachers and relatives. We learn from them, and they're considered to be our relatives, and we would care for them. That's a very different kind of worldview and ontology of our relationship to the natural world, and our knowledge and legal and governance systems would have enabled those kind of relationships. Now, having said that, I will never say that we were perfect. Absolutely not. And what I find in the work that I do is I do what's called story work. I work with a lot of our stories. So in our stories, we certainly made a lot of mistakes. The difference was we could address the mistakes on our own terms. We could figure out our challenges and solutions on our own terms. And that's what doesn't happen now. Other people have solutions for what they imagine to be, the problems facing Indigenous peoples. They're out of our control. And we don't get to self-determine our own solutions a lot of the times, whereas traditionally we did. When we did make mistakes or we faced a huge challenge, that's what we were able to do. So I'm not going to say we were perfect people or romanticize that. I don't think that's helpful. There was very hard work and intellectually and physically demanding to maintain these kind of relationships with the natural world to ensure that life would continue. That was our ultimate goal. So the policy context. So in Canada, two big reports came out. One is the final report, the Truth and Reconciliation Report, and that was investigating the residential schools and the legacy of the residential schools, which is in my family. My mother's a residential school survivor, and so was her mother, my grandmother. And what this, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found was that there was, a policy of genocide, cultural genocide to eradicate Indigenous peoples. And this is very relevant in a policy context, because if you don't account for this history and the intergenerational trauma and the ongoing colonialism, then you run the risk of recolonizing. So, and a lot of the impetus for, or motivation, for lack of a better word, for this genocide of Indigenous peoples released in this report in 2015 was to be able to obtain the lands from Indigenous peoples, for reasons that Indigenous peoples, for purposes that Indigenous peoples wouldn't have wanted to happen. Another report released in 2019 is the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women and Girls report. And again, the same thing, genocide, racism, discrimination. Women particularly impacted by the actions of governments and others, and this continues on into the present day. What was interesting about this report was in its calls to justice, they specifically speak to the role of proponents in resource extraction and development in Indigenous communities to the continued violence experienced by Indigenous people, particularly women and girls. So these are very recent reports that have come out, and thinking through how do they then influence climate change or environmental policy. Folks are still trying to wrap their heads around that. They don't always see a connection. When I talk about the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women and Girls report, they're like, what does that have to do with climate change policy? And I go, well, it has everything to do with climate change policy, because if you don't acknowledge that this is a reality historically and now, then you don't account for that, you could potentially and likely will cause more harm in Indigenous communities. So to me, they matter in a policy context and the policy work that I'm doing. I'm also part of Climate Change Choices, a think tank that is trying to think through solutions to climate change. And some of the work I do there is to say, you need to think about these kind of things in the policy development and analysis that occurs. So Indigenous knowledge systems, and I know I'm hopping through different topics fairly quickly here. But I thought it was important to talk about the difference between Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems. This is an area I find in the work that I do that tends to be very confusing for folks. So in Canada, probably for the last 20 years, the environmental legislation, particularly the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and formerly the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and now the Impact Assessment Act, did recognize Indigenous knowledge. This is because of international conventions and meetings that Canada was a signatory to, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, Agenda 21, a lot of it coming out of the Earth Summit Rio meeting of 1992. But they don't really know what to do. I mean, this is recognized in legislation, policy, but then, we're not exactly, as educators or in educational institutions, training people like how do you do this? I found that was a big part of my job in Environment Canada, was people were told they had to do this, but they had no idea what they were doing and how to do it. But so the difference between Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems is you'll see Indigenous knowledge recognized even in the Paris Agreement, but not necessarily Indigenous knowledge systems, because like anything, any kind of knowledge is generated within a system. So we're generating knowledge all the time. I'm generating knowledge out of York University. You're generating knowledge out of Princeton or wherever people happen to be, wherever they're studying or working in a policy context. So we're generating knowledge as part of a system. I'm part of a system at York University, part of the public school system, publicly funded system in Ontario. And so what counts as knowledge is generated in particular ways, who's considered to be an expert, how it's peer reviewed, what we consider to be valid knowledge. It's all part of a system that's funded in ways, what programs get funded, how they're evaluated. So it's all part of a broader system, how we're educating right from preschool up to, when students are in graduate school or law school. It's the same thing with Indigenous societies. It's all part of a system, all part of Indigenous legal system, governance system. Who's considered to be an expert? How do we validate knowledge? How does knowledge transform over time? But the way that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems is approached is very extractive. How do we extract certain bits of knowledge that we might find relevant to what's important to us? And what I mean by that is in Canada, a lot of the people who have to do the traditional knowledge work that's part of legislation are proponents of development. So they extract a lot of their methods are to extract knowledge from communities in particular ways to kind of suit their interests, because they're required to do this as part of a environmental assessment, or it's also as part of the Species at Risk Act for species recovery. They don't want to recognize the whole knowledge system or Indigenous peoples and work with them as peoples, but it's more about how do we extract this knowledge from people. So that tends to be the predominant sort of way that it's kind of approached in Canada. And what that does for Indigenous communities is they feel like they want to share this knowledge because they see that it's needed, but at the same time they need to protect it. So there's this sort of like ongoing tension that exists. But Indigenous knowledge systems in an Anishinaabe context, which I know the best, considers our relationships among all our relations, all the living things, spirit world, ancestors, and those yet to come. So it's much broader than I would be thinking about if I were having a research conversation with my colleagues at Osgoode or in environmental studies. Again, it's embedded within systems. It's something that you do. It's actually a noun. It's like a verb, it's a verb as opposed to a noun. You're expected to act on it. You start to embody this knowledge. And with this knowledge are roles and responsibilities, and it goes beyond the human dimension. It's not just people who have this, but other entities in the environment, in the world, also have roles and responsibilities. And the conduct applies to all beings, not just to peoples. And I'll talk about this in the water justice context, where this starts to come out, where it starts to matter. All of this tends to be, what, for lack of a better word, normal thinking in an Indigenous context. But Environment Canada, if I talked about this, people have had a very hard time wrapping their heads around it. They had a very, very hard time trying to understand in Indigenous context what Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems meant. So for example, one element is that we understand water to be a relative and to be a being, and that it can also collect knowledge. It's not just humans who do that. So it's all, again, part of the system, an Indigenous system is other entities are also collecting knowledge, and also can feel trauma and also experience trauma that people might. Indigenous legal traditions, how are they relevant in all of this? So these are, I'm not going to read these quotes. You can read them. It's a thing in the Canadian context, increasingly more so in law schools. In fact, there's a new program at the University of Victoria in British Columbia that's a joint JD program along with Indigenous legal traditions. The students are learning both in that program. And part of this is starting to codify and document Indigenous legal traditions so they could be understood by others. As I said before, they already existed for thousands of years, but now it's like, okay, how can they be explained? How can they be codified in a way that they're going to be understood by others, because we want them to be able to apply. And this basically comes from I think, a logical and reasonable conclusion, which is every report that's coming out of the IPCC or IPBS that deals with ecosystems and species has been pointing to, a fairly rapid decline in the planet, in planetary health. And so whatever the systems are, the governance systems, the legal systems that are policy systems that are working right now are actually not really working all that well for the planet. So what other kind of legal systems, what other kind of knowledge systems needs to happen? And so Indigenous peoples are saying, among others, not just Indigenous people, are saying we need our own legal traditions to be part of these, part of the solutions that we're talking about. Oh, sorry, I just thought there was I was getting a time thing in the chat, a time reminder. So Indigenous legal traditions is important. I do some of this work in relation to climate justice. Is what does it look like, and what kind of impact can it have, and what does it tell us about how we're to relate to the natural world? And I wanted to give an example. So this is an image of my family and what we call the sugar bush, our maple syrup camp. Which finished probably, it was early this year because it was warm. It got too warm, and the temperature needs to be above zero during the day and below zero at night, Celsius, Canadian context, in order for the sap to flow. This year was a bit strange, but here we have, so it's an Anishinabe concept, and probably there'd be debates on this. Is it a legal principle? Is it a law? And it was basically one that my father, who is a fluent speaker, thought in the language. I wasn't taught my language, although I'm trying to learn. And so in my family, like you'll notice that, people adapt to whatever the situation is, but we don't do what, it was actually a student who told me what it was, that pipeline system where people attach all these pipes to the different trees, and it collects the sap and it goes to a central, I don't even know what you call it, boiler, I guess, where it gets evaporated and boiled down. But we wouldn't do that. My father wouldn't hear of it. And he just said, because what you start to do, it starts to change the way that you think. It starts to change the way that you relate. So every year it gets decided by meeting with each tree, which one's going to be tapped, which one's going to be left, or which ones are going to be left for a year or two in order to replenish themselves. And he said that if you pipeline those trees, you no longer have that kind of relationship, because when you're gathering the sap, you have to go to all the trees at least twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day, depending on how the sap is flowing. So you're always in contact with, you're always in communication with the trees, and with that pipeline, you're not, because it's all just kind of being, sucked in a certain way. But probably more critical was this idea of you start to change the way that you think and behave, because then you start taking from those trees as opposed to receiving a gift. So in our, we have a number of stories around how the maple syrup and sugar, and particularly the sap, came to us. And it was about this time of year, well, actually a little bit earlier, usually March, and whenever the full moon is. and March, and it varies. And that's a time when Anishinabe would have been facing traditionally food insecurity, because it's very hard to hunt in the snow when it's kind of like you can't walk on top of it, and sometimes you sink and sometimes you don't. It's very hard to move. The water may have not have broken up yet in order to be able to fish, and it's not safe to be on the ice at that time. So the ice may have not have broken up. So it's very hard to get food. And the winter stores would have been depleting around this time. So this tree offers its gift in our stories at this time when we need it the most to save us, because it's very nutritious when it's coming from the tree. So in our stories, it's understood to be sweet water or medicine water because of the nutrients in it coming at a time when we really need it. So it's understood to be a gift that comes from that tree. So our the way we interact with the maple trees is understanding that as being a gift, and then the way that we approach the gathering of the sap is receiving a gift, and that's different than taking. So there's a line there, and I call this that line of that challenges a lot of common perceptions of Indigenous people, which is, and I hear it all the time in my field, unfortunately, even when I worked for Environment Canada, like it was, in my opinion, kind of racist, really, is, those Indigenous people, they were just too primitive. They just didn't have the technology in order to cause the widespread environmental damage that other people did. But it's not true, because in my family, we could. My mother's a teacher. I'm one of 9. We're all fairly well educated. We could do that, but we don't, because you cross that line of receiving a gift versus taking. So there's there's these ideas that exist there that where it's not a good idea. You don't do that because you're going to cross that line. You're going to actually. I was thinking about this on a walk. I go, I don't even know if it's a line per se. Like maybe it's sort of like I'm being too academic and I'm being too binary in my thinking. But this ethic or principle or law that of your proper conduct and behavior in relation to the natural world and the gifts that it has to offer us, but we don't take, because then you start to become tempted to take too much and to take for reasons other than accepting this as a gift in a time of great need. So I wanted to talk about this concept of Menin. So for the Anishinabe and other nations, as I understand it in my interactions with them, have their own concepts of this, but it's this like what we understand to be a good life, living a good life. So Menin is a good life, living a good life, a good way of life. These are just some different ways of thinking about it. It's kind of a big deal in the Anishinabe world. It also generally, like when it started to kind of emerge as a concept in the academic world, scholarly world, it was more in the health, and then started to emerge within the environmental realm, usually through the work, actually initially through the work of Winona LaDuke, who some of you might be familiar with. And but this concept of Menin doesn't just apply to people. We cannot be well unless the natural world is well. All of creation as well. So this applies beyond people. So almost anything I could say about Anishinabe worldview is it extends beyond the human dimension. It's applying to these other dimensions of what we understand to be alive, I guess our ontology. So Menin is an important concept. So what we strive for, not just for us, not just humans are the center of the universe and we only care about humans, but for all of creation. And our laws are meant to allow for good relations. And this is work of Professor M.A. Kraft she focuses a lot on this concept for her work on water justice. So we have our own concepts for what it is that we're striving for. One could maybe argue, probably I've done this in some places that I've written, could think of it as a concept of sustainability, I suppose. Environmental justice. So these are kind of the conventional ideas of environmental justice. You're probably familiar with it. The United States, US EPA, a bit ahead of the game in terms of actually developing environmental justice policy and a specific tribal policy. Canada doesn't have this, although there's a bill going through that acknowledges environmental racism. How people are going to be able to assess that's another matter without any kind of policy or other process being set up to implement something like that. But just in Canada, starting to figure out what this is in the policy realm. But what is Indigenous environmental justice? And I did start to try to think about this, and I'll explain what sort of influenced my thinking on this. So typically, because Indigenous studies tends to be like a new discipline, for lack of a better word, merging 60s, 70s, 80s as part of a lot of Indigenous community and people's advocacy to say, our own perspectives aren't represented in the academy, our own knowledges, our own ways of how we think, our own priorities for research and teaching. Because generally anything Indigenous was under other disciplines. And universities are very disciplined in terms of that's anthropology, that's English, that's political science, that's, and so Indigenous peoples or topics tends to be like a topic within these other disciplines. I was trying to look at this from what is it if it stands on its own? What does Indigenous environmental justice look like when it's not a topic in geography or environmental studies or whatever, political science, whatever it might be? What does it look like when it stands on its own? Just like Indigenous knowledge and laws did for thousands of years, what does it look like? What does it look like when you're drawing upon that? And so it's more than just looking at injustices, because that is important. I won't deny that, but most academics, including myself, we're really good at diagnosing. Like we like to identify problems and diagnose them, but sometimes not that great at what's the solution or path forward. In terms of, okay, what does the justice look like? What is Indigenous environmental justice look like? We know what injustices look like. They're everywhere, front page news a lot of the times. And we're good at that. And there's a lot of theory, methods, everything developed around what the injustices look like. But what does justice actually look like? How does it relate to Namadzuin or sustainability? What are our responsibilities? And so this is sort of how I was trying to think about this. What might be some of the different questions we ask ourselves? As an Anishinabe, we think about what kind of ancestor we're going to be. I'm a descendant of my ancestors who managed to, survive, genocide. And here I am. I can say I'm part of an Anishinabe nation. And so what does it mean? What are my obligations to ensure that my descendants will live well? That's part of how we might think about in Anishinaabe environmental justice in particular. But what does it look like based on our own knowledge, governance systems, and laws, as opposed to the injustices that we experience as part of other processes? Because that's going on and great scholarship developed there. But to me, it doesn't quite get at what Indigenous peoples might mean in all of this. So some of the underlying assumptions that I did see in the environmental justice sphere, and again, I'm the first person to say it's very relevant and great scholarship, but it just doesn't. It's just like if I were to think about environmental justice scholarship like this, Indigenous would be a lot broader. Like it's true and it's relevant, but it's not the whole story, right? So what I did find was there was that human nature divide. There's the humans and there's the environment, and then the environmental injustice. Binaries, like binaries is still a predominant way of thinking in sort of how an environmental justice is identified and diagnosed. It doesn't recognize necessarily the historical trauma, let's say, of the waters or land itself. Of people, it's very people focused, very state and people focused, as opposed to the entities in and of themselves as having agency. Healing would be a big part of it, because not only are we concerned about the injustice to the water, but then how do we go about trying to heal the waters, ensure the well-being of the waters? It's what is the actual vision of Indigenous peoples in terms of what is it that we want to see in the context that we're dealing with? And how do we self-determine that kind of future? So self-determination would be a big part of how Indigenous peoples or how I understand it, conceptualizes Indigenous environmental justice. So it didn't really, those conversations weren't really part of the for lack of a better word, mainstream environmental justice sort of scholarship. You know, even though it's critically important, it's got its own set of assumptions that are that you know, I would say Indigenous people certainly include, but ours is a lot broader. So there's some unique considerations, and there's scholarship around this as you know, a number of scholars push the boundaries on that politically, legally, because of sovereignty and self-determination, self-government agreements, Indigenous state relations, and how those are changing over time. In Canada, the reconciliation agenda, the fiduciary obligation or trust-like obligations, the role of Indigenous governance in all of this, and again, what our own logic is, our own worldview and ontology, our own logic, the way that we understand who we're supposed to be in the world. So there's these different aspects, you know, that become part of that environmental justice conversation in an Indigenous context. So I wanted to apply a little bit of this to water justice, what that might look like. And it's based on the assumption that Indigenous peoples already had their own ideas about what environmental justice looks like. What does it mean to have just relationships with the natural world? And part of this was, this is where the laws and natural law becomes really important, because you needed to understand the natural and ecological processes, because you respected them, you didn't interfere with them. So for example, you don't interfere with the rights of the other beings and entities to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. So in the water context, and this is where I first started to doing work around this, around water security and water justice, was and talking to elders and traditional knowledge holders. And this was work that I was doing with in Ontario, the Chiefs of Ontario. So they represent 133 of the First Nations in Ontario. And we are doing a submission to the Walkerton Commission. And Walkerton was a water tragedy that killed a number of people in southern Ontario in a non-Indigenous community and context. And so we were doing a submission to this, and my job was to go out and talk to the knowledge keepers and elders, grandmothers, grandfathers about what our perspective of this would be. And what they said was, they said a number of things. One of them was that water also has roles and responsibilities, and its primary role is to support life, is to give life, to support life. And when we interfere with that as humans by contaminating, by creating a dam, by disrespecting water in all the different ways that people tend to do it, then we've infringed upon the roles and responsibilities and rights of water, and we don't have the right to do that. That water has its own responsibilities, and because of that, water can then harm, because we can drink contaminated water. People can then be harmed by what happens to water. And so water doesn't want to do that. Water would rather support life, and all life, not just for people, but for aquatic life, for the medicines that people, for wildlife that rely on clean water for living. And so it was a very different idea about what water was, going way beyond H2O to understand water as a living entity, as having its own agency, which to some extent is being recognized through the rights of nature, personhood of nature, sort of. I don't even want to call it a movement, because it's very real. Just Canada's first case in February of 2021, this year, a few months ago, for a river that the Innu care for, take care of. So there's this whole different idea about what water is and its own nature, and what its own obligations are in relation to people. So you're applying a different worldview and a different sort of ontology to understanding what water is. So we had our own ideas about this as Anishinabe people. So Indigenous peoples have their own ideas about what just relations look like in relation to the natural world, that go beyond people, that don't necessarily always focus on the state, when for sure that's an issue now, but it's not the, again, it's not the whole story, and it's not the whole picture. So how then would we go about trying to obtain water justice when there's major water insecurity around the world? World water reports come out every June 22nd on World Water Day, pointing to not looking good in relation to water and water security, recognized as a basic human right now by the United Nations in 2010 through a resolution. So how do we go about this? What does it kind of look like? How can we obtain justice with water? So this could be through renewing our covenant between people and the waters, because we take care of each other. The relationship is also reciprocal. So water can take care of us, you know, by being life-giving, and we would take care of water by caring for water and not infringing upon its right to you know, live up to its roles and responsibility. The idea of giving versus taking. So I've written about this before too, this idea of even what sustainable development means, which typically in the UN context means how do we keep taking in a sustainable way so future generations can keep taking. That's kind of like the basic kind of notion of what it is. And in talking to elders, particularly one elder, he's passed away, the late Robin Green, or Maji Benes was his Anishinaabe name. He just said, what Anishinaabe do every day is we don't get up thinking about what we're going to take. We get up thinking about what we're going to give. What are we going to give back to the earth? What are we going to give back? So there's this very different way of thinking about how we're going to be in the world. Not about what we can take, what's going to be profit, but what are we going to give back to ensure the continuance of life? But we do have concepts that are in our stories of greed and consumption getting out of control, and those are these beings called Wendigos, and they come in many different forms. Robin Kimmerer, whose work you might be familiar with, beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that she wrote, talks more about this concept. But so we were warned about that. It's in our stories. Like when you consume, you start taking more than you need. That's very bad in the society. So we have choice about who we want to be in the world. What kind of path are we going to take? Because we want to ensure well-being for all of creation and for life to continue. So our concepts of water justice are about ensuring those kind of reciprocal kind of relationships and coexistence with water. I'm also working on another project you could probably look up called Decolonizing Water. And a big part of that project is understanding what these Anishinabe or Indigenous, because it's Canada-wide, so it's different nations and societies, laws and knowledge, what that looks like when that becomes applied in order to be able to achieve water justice. What does governance look like? And essentially one of the key findings in Anishinaabe context is it's actually arrogant to think that we can govern water. What we do is we try to coexist with water, because water is actually more powerful than we are. So that's a lot of what our legal and our governance systems look like in relation to water. But yet we're confronted every day with people who think about water governance very differently. So I wanted to end. There's a lot more content to cover, but I want to make sure that there's time for discussion and questions. Is what our self-determined solutions could look like. This image is actually taken from a youth elders gathering on climate change that I facilitated a few years ago, but it was hugely influential in terms of how I think. A lot of what we confront environmentally, when these reports come out, and it's becoming even more and more intense in terms of the changes, the planetary changes that are occurring and affecting the health of the planet, and everything in it is become very overwhelming. And for Indigenous peoples, we have to think about, how do we self-determine our own future? How do we self-determine our own solutions? So the reports that I talked about, those reports, the Truth and Reconciliation Report, Murdered, Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, a lot of these public commissions have always said other people's solutions to the challenges that Indigenous peoples face tend to fail and have been inappropriate because they're not based on our knowledge or our laws or our lived reality and our lived experience. So we need to self-determine our own. We need to self-determine our own approaches to these based on our own knowledge systems. It doesn't mean you're rejecting any of the others. We actually have models and concepts for what that could look like. Another project that I'm working on, really trying to develop those a lot more. But we do need to self-determine our solutions. You just can't always just accept the dominant narrative out there, because that dominant narrative doesn't include a lot of Indigenous people's knowledge, experiences, and ideas and knowledge systems in those processes. So we need to figure out what this means on our own terms, and will likely be beneficial and helpful to others. I like to mention this because what I find in Indigenous contexts and Indigenous meetings, and last week I was at the College of the Menominee Nation Sustainable Development Institute Climate Change Conference, and in Indigenous context, it's not unusual. It's normal to talk about loving the earth as being a relevant concept in these conversations. And it wasn't in this context. This is just some of the art that was developed by the youth that were there, where you love yourself, you love the earth. Like, what are we doing that's showing this? In other policy circles that I'm in, never comes up. I actually had a student go through the IPCC reports, IBS reports, and just go, tell me if this concept comes up there at all in any of this, and it doesn't. But it's very relevant in an Indigenous context. We have our own values and principles that we apply to how we think and what we believe, how we assess and how we diagnose what the problem is and what we think the solutions might be to determine our future. So this is just an image of the youth that were there. I just love this quote from Robin Kimmerer, because again, when you think about when you have a worldview and ontology of the land and the earth as having agency, then it can also, like, we may love the earth, but thinking about how it might love us back, how water might love us back, and how would we behave as a result of that if we actually understood and we actually like perceived that and experienced that? What would that look like? So this comes from her work, because she's a scientist, but she also works with she's Potawatomi as well. So she works with Indigenous knowledge systems in her work. So Sigadwin is Anishinabe word for love. So I like to end with this. So this is, again, I like to work with stories. So one of the storytellers I like to work with is Isaac Day, amazing storyteller. I can never tell the story as well as he can, but people want to understand what their role is in all of this. Like, what could be non-Indigenous people's role in Indigenous contexts, or vice versa? What's our role in everything that's happening on the planet? And he just says, we're all part of the sacred story, the unfolding of the earth. Everything that's happening, we're all part of it. And we decide who we're going to be in that story, but we're all in it together. So we need to work together and share our knowledge in a way that's going to ensure this continued unfolding sacred story of the earth. And miigwech means thank you. So thank you for bearing with me, and hopefully that made sense to you, even though it felt like a bit of a brain dump.
Thank you so much, Professor McGregor. We really appreciate you joining us for this talk today. We have a few minutes left for questions. So if you're an attendee and you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or submit it in the Q&A. One of the first ones we received, Professor Elke Weber, I'm going to allow you to talk. I think it would be easiest if you ask your question, if you don't mind.
Okay, I can do that. Thank you so much for your really, really interesting presentation. My undergraduate degree actually is from York University, so I send my greetings back to my alma mater. But the question I have for you is about the Indigenous knowledge system you described. And it's, from your description, so much broader and balanced in its time horizon, going back to the past, going forward to future generations, and also inclusive in its relations to other species, to what we call non-sentient entities. And I guess my question is this characterization an idealization, or is it actually reality? And if the latter, then how is such a knowledge system instilled and maintained? And by way of background, I'm asking this as a psychologist who often argues that a somewhat myopic focus on the here and now and on us is by implication a universal result of our evolutionary history, but you're actually proving it otherwise.
Well, I'll try to answer the question if I'm understanding it properly. Is this would be taught to people very early on to be able to relate to and understand the natural world. Like we have, like often this is done through ceremonies and other kind of practices, usually land-based. This is why a lot of Indigenous communities, why that land back is very important, and why land-based educational pedagogies, and I would also say water-based pedagogies is really important, because that connection has been severed in a lot of Indigenous communities through that residential school process and other kind of educational processes that don't recognize that. So, and actually that was an important conversation on the panel that I was on for the Shifting Seasons conference with the College of the Menominee Nation, was how do we get people to get it again? Like, how do we get people to just love the earth again and feel like they're being loved as well? And so, so it's a thing, and it's also thinking, so kids already kind of know how to do this. So in my own experience, what I do, and it kind of freaks students out, is whether I'm teaching law or whether I'm teaching graduate students, I send them outside and I say, go try to, and I explain what I just said to you, this ontology, this worldview. So I need you to see what you can do and not do, and what you can understand or not understand about this. Are you able to listen to what the wind has to say and what the animals have to say? So they have to go out and do that, try to work with their senses, because in the academic world, we tend to be very abstract. Everything becomes text-based, what we read, what we write. Maybe we think knowledge mobilization is being fancy because we made a video or something else, but really it's still kind of dominates certain parts of our, I guess, intellectual faculties. So it's getting them to do that. And I found that when I used to teach first year, where the students could be 16, 17, 18, they had a lot easier time because we didn't educate it out of them. So they had an easier time with that. They were able to describe to me what their relationship was to the natural world. The older they got, the more educated, the harder it actually was for them. It was very kind of abstract for them, or literally some of them couldn't do it. They couldn't. So I think for Indigenous peoples, it's taught. It's a normal part of how you would be brought up, and you're essentially educating a lot of people or telling them that's just so primitive. Why don't you get with the program? So it's very that mentality is still very much kind of out there in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems. But I guess a practical example that I would give you is, so we did a source water protection plan in my community, and built into it is the ceremonial life, where there would be ceremonies 4 times a year during the equinox or the solstice, where you're recognizing the water beings that are in the water. So that's actually built into the technical scientific source water protection plan, and water walks for the kids even up to the preschool level. So yeah, it's very real in Indigenous communities. It's just starting to become recognized elsewhere. That's a long-winded way of answering the question. Now there's probably time for no others. So apologies to everybody else for that.
That's great. We are short on time, but I did have one other question for you. In terms of, you've spoken very eloquently about knowledge as a verb, and a number of our students are trying to think about how to incorporate environmental justice perspectives into their research. You've kind of set up, these knowledge systems. The one of the university and Indigenous knowledge systems is 2 very, very different things and different approaches. I'm wondering, for the students who are trying to engage in this, have you seen examples of that working well together, maybe different types of knowledge systems coming together to work effectively for environmental policies? And maybe you could give us an example or some tips and pointers for the students.
Probably the most important thing is to be ready for it, is to be open to what you're going to hear, what you're going to see, and what you're going to experience. This is the big age-old question. Like, this is the big question. Like, in our funding agencies, they're trying to wrap their heads around for social science, humanities, CHR, and certain the natural engineering sciences. And this was the model work that I was talking about. So you can, and I'm a part of a project, but that's the whole question of the project actually, is around how do different knowledge systems interact with each other? And so that project is called Conservation as Reconciliation. So you can find the website for that. And what we're doing is working around this concept of ethical space, where you're not saying one knowledge system is better than the other, but what you're trying to do is create the space for the conversation. Because I think that the first assumption you have to kind of let go of is that we're only talking about knowledge systems. We never are. We're always talking about people. How do scientists get along with Indigenous people? Not how you're going to suck knowledge out of Indigenous people so it can become part of some sort of technical assessment. So it's very much based on people. So there's different models for that. In Robin Kimmerer's book, which I recommend people read, she talks about the braiding of different knowledge systems. There's scholars I'm working with who talk about the weaving of different knowledge systems so they maintain their integrity, because there's great value in science. I don't want to come across acting like there isn't. There is. I have a science degree, a couple of them. So, but they're just not proving to be able to address everything that we're facing, right, in the appropriate way. So those models recognize the distinctness of the systems, but how they can come together to address the common thing that we care about. So, and actually I'm working on another project with Dr. Jessie Popp, so read her work, Dr. Andrea Reed. This is totally what they do. They're hardcore scientists, Indigenous, one's Niska, one's Anishinabe, and that's what they're doing in their work. The two-eyed seeing approach is another one, is we're actually developing like a 7-year program of summer institutes where we're training students to do exactly what the students were asking. Like, how do you do this? But for me, first and foremost, you recognize you're working with people. So you need to know who the people are. What is their nation? What are their treaties? What are their values? What is their worldview and ontology? So you're not like, oh my God, that's a thing. It's like, yeah, it's a thing here. So you gotta be ready for that. Yeah, so it's a good question. So thank you for that question.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm sorry to those of you who submitted questions, we won't have time to get to them. There's a lot of great questions about different organizations and comparative studies and all of that. But thank you so much for joining us today, Professor McGregor. We really appreciate you sharing your approach to this work with us. And thank you to all of the attendees who joined us today. This was, again, the last seminar in our spring series, but we will be starting up again in the fall semester. And hopefully eventually we'll have people back in person for some of these sessions, and then maybe one day we'll see you on Princeton's campus, Professor McGregor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon or morning or evening, wherever it is that you are. And thank you for having me. Like you can tell, I get excited about this topic, so I really appreciate the invitation and an opportunity. And thank you for coming out the end of the term and listening to what I have to say about this, and hopefully